I stood before Julia, announcing my decision with a stern resolve. I'm moving in with my parents. If you're against it, then let's get a divorce, I declared, my voice devoid of any emotion. Julia looked at me in disbelief, her mind racing to comprehend the audacity of my words. The impact was like a slap across her face. What are you talking about, Ellen? She stammered, her voice reflecting a mix of shock and confusion. It's simple, I continued, my eyes cold and calculating. We'll use your $2 million inheritance to build a house there. That's the plan. A knot tightened in Julia's stomach. The inheritance, her mother's final gift, was now a tool in my scheme. You can't be serious, she whispered. Oh, I'm dead serious, Julia. It's time to make some changes, I replied sharply. Memories of our life together flashed through her mind. The laughter, love, the birth of our children. How did we end up here? At 38, a mother of 2, she had thought she was living a normal life with a man she once loved. But now I stood before her, a stranger. You have no right to decide how my inheritance is used, she protested, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. As your husband, I think I do. It's either my way or the highway, Julia. Decide, I declared, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. She stared at me, trying to find a trace of the man she married, but all she saw was a greedy stranger eyeing her inheritance like a vulture. Realization hit her standing in the shadow of the man she no longer recognized. Her marriage was a lie. Fine, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. If that's how you want it, we're done. But don't expect to touch a dime of my money. My smirk vanished, replaced by shock. I hadn't expected this. I turned on my heel and left, slamming the door behind me. Alone, Julia stood there, her heart pounding. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just about money. It was about her dignity, her freedom. The next morning, the house felt eerily silent as Julia prepared breakfast. The previous night's confrontation replayed in her mind, fueling her anger. How could I be so callous? The money was a part of her mother's legacy, not some windfall for me to squander. Our children, Emma and Ryan, noticed the tension but remained quiet. They were too young to understand the complexity of adult conflicts, yet they sensed something was amiss. Julia forced a smile for their sake. After dropping them off at school, she drove to her mother's empty house, echoing with memories. Sitting in the living room, she recalled the times my parents had made insensitive remarks about their lifestyle, choices, and even their children. They had always favored traditional gender roles, and unfortunately, I seemed to have inherited their archaic views. I can't comprehend why you're still working. Alan's mother once sneered, her disdain evident. A woman's place is at home with her children. Alan, my husband, never stood up for me. He consistently brushed off his parents' derogatory comments, urging me to ignore them. However, their words were like needles, steadily pricking away at my self-esteem. Now, with my mother gone and my marriage falling apart, I felt a surge of resentment towards Alan. He had never truly been my partner, leaving me to fend for myself against his parents' criticisms and never once taking my side. I vividly remembered when I was pregnant with Emma, and Alan's parents openly expressed their hope for a grandson. When Emma was born, their disappointment was palpable. Next time, make sure it's a boy, they had said, barely concealing their dissatisfaction. Witnessing my daughter subjected to such blatant favoritism was painful. Now, Alan wanted to use my inheritance to move closer to them, to immerse ourselves in their toxic environment. The thought made my blood boil. I couldn't and wouldn't let that happen. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's life, a plan began to form in my mind. I refused to be bullied into submission. I would fight back not just for myself, but for my children too. Alan had revealed his true colors, and it was time for him to face the consequences. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for war. Over the next few days, I gathered documents and prepared for the legal battle ahead. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Miss Henderson, assured me that we had a strong case. Don't worry, Julia. We'll make sure that inheritance stays where it rightfully belongs, she said with a confident smile. One evening, as I sorted through my mother's belongings, I stumbled upon an old, dusty envelope tucked away in a drawer. Inside, I found a set of documents, stock certificates, and property deeds. My hands trembled as I realized the extent of my mother's secret savings, including the current value of the stocks and the property. It amounted to a staggering $2 million. I couldn't believe it. My mother, who had lived so modestly, had been sitting on a small fortune. She had always been prudent with money, but I never imagined she had accumulated so much. A note accompanied the documents, written in her neat handwriting. Julia, I saved this for a rainy day. I hope it gives you and the kids a better life. Use it wisely. Tears welled up in my eyes. My mother's foresight and love felt like a warm embrace even from beyond the grave. The next day, I decided to confront Alan. He needed to know that his plan to squander my inheritance was doomed to fail. I found him in the living room, lazily flipping through a magazine. Alan, we need to talk, I said, my voice steady. He looked up, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. What is it now, Julia? I discovered something of my mother's. I began, holding up the envelope. Turns out, she left me stocks and properties worth $2 million. Alan's eyes widened, a mix of shock and greed flashing across his face. $2 million? That's great news, he exclaimed, his reaction disgusting me. Don't get any ideas, Alan. This money is mine and the kids. You won't see a cent of it. His expression turned dark. You can't keep it all to yourself, Julia. We're married. What's yours is mine, he retorted. I felt a surge of anger. You've shown your true colors, Alan. You don't care about me or the kids. All you see is dollar signs. Alan stood up, his face red with anger. You're being selfish, Julia. I'm thinking about our future, about our family. What family, Alan? The one you're ready to abandon for your own selfish needs. I shot back. He took a step towards me, fists clenched. You'll regret this, Julia. I'll make sure of it. I stood my ground, unwavering. Bring it on, Alan. I'm not afraid of you anymore. He stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew this was just the beginning of a long and bitter battle, but I was ready for my children, for my mother's legacy, and for myself. The following week was a whirlwind of legal consultations and tense silences at home. Alan's attitude had shifted from shock to a cold, calculated aggression. He was like a caged animal, desperate and dangerous. One evening, as the kids were asleep, Alan cornered me in the kitchen. His eyes were wild, his posture aggressive. You think you're clever, Julia. Hiding that money from me, he accused. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding but my voice steady. It's not about being clever, Alan. It's about what's right. That money is for me and the kids, not for your deluded fantasies. He slammed his fist on the countertop, making me jump. I am your husband. I have rights to that money. You're just a... His words were like venom, but I cut him off. A what, Alan? A woman who won't bow down to your greed and bullying. His face contorted in anger. You'll regret this, Julia. I'll make sure you don't get a dime of that money. I could feel the danger in his words, but I refused to show fear. Is that a threat, Alan? He leaned in, his breath foul. It's a promise. I pushed past him, my body shaking with adrenaline. We'll see about that. The court will decide. As I walked away, his voice followed me, filled with malice. You're going to be left with nothing, Julia. Nothing. The next day, I received a call from my lawyer. Julia, Alan has filed for divorce. He's claiming half of your inheritance. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. Let him try. I'll fight him every step of the way. Miss Henderson's voice was firm. We have a strong case, Julia. Don't worry. We'll make sure justice is served. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about my children sleeping peacefully in their rooms. I dedicated myself to this battle for my children, for their future. Alan had transformed into a stranger, a man driven by greed and malice. Yet I was no longer the woman he believed he could control and intimidate. As I closed my eyes, I pictured the courtroom, the judge, and the final verdict. I envisioned myself standing tall, fighting vigorously, not just for the money, but for my dignity, my children's future, and the quiet strength my mother had always exemplified. This was my battle, and I was prepared for it. The ensuing legal battle was arduous. Alan's strategy was transparent, to portray me as an uncooperative wife, hoarding the family's resources. However, his arguments were feeble, more rooted in desperation than in law. One afternoon, we faced each other in mediation, a final attempt to settle before the court hearing. Alan sat across from me, his lawyer by his side, his gaze cold, and his demeanor smug. "Let's be reasonable, Julia," his lawyer began. "Alan is entitled to a portion of this inheritance. It's only fair." I glanced at Miss Henderson, my resolve unyielding. Fair. Alan has made no contribution to this inheritance. It is solely from my late mother, intended for me and my children. Alan leaned forward, his voice scornful. "Come on, Julia. You're just being spiteful. Don't you think the kids would want their father to have a share?" I felt a surge of anger. "This isn't about spite, Alan. It's about justice. You've never cared about what the kids want. This is about your greed." His lawyer tried to interject, but Alan signaled him to stop. "You think you can just take everything, don't you, Julia? Play the grieving daughter and the victimized wife." I met his gaze squarely. "This isn't a game, Alan. You're the one trying to take what isn't yours." The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, interjected. "Let's try to remain civil. This is about finding a resolution." Alan cut her off, his voice rising. "A resolution? She's the one being unreasonable." I could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. I spoke calmly yet firmly. "I am being perfectly reasonable. I'm protecting what my mother left for her grandchildren. Alan's claims are baseless." The mediator called for a break, sensing the futility of the discussion. As we stood up, Alan leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear. "You'll pay for this, Julia. I'll make sure of it." I walked out of the room, my heart racing but my spirit unbroken. Alan's threats were hollow, his case weak. I knew the law was on my side, and I was determined to see this through to the end. In the following weeks, I immersed myself in legal documents, met with Miss Henderson, and prepared for the court hearing. The kids stayed with my sister, shielded from the worst of the storm. I missed them terribly, but I knew this fight was for their future as much as it was for mine. The day of the hearing arrived. Standing in the courtroom, I braced myself to confront Alan and whatever deceptive narrative he planned to weave. This was the moment of truth, and I was prepared to fight with every ounce of strength within me. The courtroom felt like a battleground where words were the weapons, and Alan's lawyer crafted a tale of a wronged husband, deprived of his rightful share. Yet, under Miss Henderson's skilled questioning, his arguments crumbled like a fragile house of cards. During a recess, Alan cornered me in the hallway, his face twisted in fury. "You're ruining everything, Julia? You think you're going to walk away with all that money?" I stood my ground despite the fear gnawing at me. "It's not your money, Alan. It never was." He stepped closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "I'll drag this out as long as it takes. I'll bleed you dry in legal fees." Meeting his gaze, my voice remained unwavering. "Do what you must. I won't let you bully me into submission." As we returned to the courtroom, a strange sense of empowerment washed over me. Alan's threats were hollow, his bravado a mask for desperation. The final verdict was a vindication. The judge ruled in my favor, acknowledging the inheritance as my sole property. Alan's face, as the judgment was delivered, reflected defeat. However, the victory was bittersweet. I had won the legal battle, but at the cost of my marriage, the family I had known shattered. In the weeks that followed, Alan's life unraveled. His reputation, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled. The community saw him for the greedy man who had attempted to take advantage of his wife's inheritance. Rumors reached me about his struggles, lost job, lost friends, lost standing in the community. It was a steep fall from grace, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. One evening, a mutual acquaintance called. "Julia, have you heard about Alan?" I hesitated. "No, what about him?" "He's moving out of town, lost his job, his house. He's pretty much broke." I felt a pang of not quite satisfaction, but something close. Alan had reaped what he had sown. He had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he had destroyed himself. I hung up the phone and looked at the picture of my children on the mantel. This fight had been for them, for their future and security. As I tucked them into bed that night, I felt a sense of peace. The battle was over, and we had emerged stronger. We were free from Alan's shadow, ready to start a new chapter. Our lives would be different, but we would be okay. We were together, and that was all that mattered. In the months following the court ruling, life settled into a new rhythm. The victory in court gave me a sense of closure, but marked the beginning of a new journey, one of healing and rebuilding. I decided to sell the house, the scene of so many bitter memories. Each item I packed was a step away from my past with Alan. I was determined to create a better future for Emma and Ryan. While going through some old boxes in the attic one day, I found a picture of Alan and me in happier times. For a moment, I allowed myself to grieve for the life I thought I had, the love I thought was real. But as I looked at his smiling face in the photo, I realized that the man I had married no longer existed. He had shown his true colors, and they were dark and ugly. I tossed the photo into the trash bin, a symbolic gesture of letting go. Moving to a new town brought a fresh start. I found a cozy home in a friendly neighborhood, and the kids enrolled in a new school, soon making friends. I focused more on my writing, finding solace in the worlds I created with my words. One evening, as I was tucking Emma into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes. "Mom, do you miss Dad?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes I miss who I thought your dad was, but we're better off now. We're a strong team, just the three of us." She nodded, a wise look in her young eyes. "I like it here, Mom. I like our new home." Her words filled me with warmth. We had indeed come a long way. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on Alan's downfall. His greed and malice had backfired, leaving him with nothing. While I harbored no joy in his misfortunes, there was a sense of justice in how things had turned out. The kids and I had a long road ahead, but we were on the path to healing. The inheritance, now securely invested, would provide for their education and our future. I closed my eyes, thinking of my mother. Her strength and foresight had saved us. In her wisdom, she had given me the means to protect myself and my children. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had left clarity and hope. We had weathered the worst, and now a new day was dawning.